Hello there. I know it's been 2 years pretty much, but I thought I'd have another go at this show. I kind of left it alone because I kind of felt a bit embarrassed on the first few episodes. I noticed that I and ah a lot. Plus, also, naming the show Dominic Subro is all well and good, but if you put Dom Sub, it kind of comes across like you're doing a kind of inconvenient show for what is appropriate on the internet. So I will call it the Dominic Subaro Show because I didn't consider the consequences and the insinuation of its previous name. So, as you may remember, my mission was to get through my DVD collection and try and tell you about some of the things I've been watching in the collection to make sure it reduces. Gotta be honest with you, the pile is still there, although what's changed since I was last there was that I live in my own house. So the pile has come with me, and even though I've got through that pile, I cannot for the life of me remember what I've got through. I've chipped away at things, but what I've definitely done is watch lots of new things as well. And I thought I'd have a go at reviewing 9 things that I've been kind of into of recent. And because I've got them all in front of me, I thought I'd have a go at being a bit more planned, and I'll tell you about each of the individual things that I've been doing. They are predominantly DVD, well, they're all DVD and graphic novel at the moment. But there is one thing I'll add as the last one. I'll make it 10 because I'll do the final novel in a series that I read. Not much to say on it though because it's not one of the things people expect to review. You'd rather hear the review in the first in the series, but I'll tell you what I've read and watched. So, to start off with, I want to tell you about the drama known as The Changes. Now, The Changes is a children's television show from the 1970s. I've got to be honest, I've always had a fondness for this type of TV. It all started with Love Film. On Love Film, because there was such a DVD collection, and obviously for all the good Netflix and Amazon Prime are, they don't have a very good catalogue of older television. It could be because they don't have the rights to it. It could be that people don't really have an interest in investing in it. And unfortunately, certain TV shows you could only really get through watching DVDs on Love Film. Unfortunately, Love Film finished, which was really actually quite upsetting. But I also acknowledged that I'd become very slow with watching the DVDs, and there is a convenience to streaming things. Like the Christmas before, I got The Changes. It's one of these shows which was a very interesting fantasy science fiction. This was science fiction show because there's a lot of experimental TV from like the 70s and 80s that I have a fondness for. For example, I'm very fond of things such as there was a TV show called The Survivor, which is by Terry Nation, the guy who created the Daleks, which was a I would say 1980s TV show about. There was a remake people might remember, which only had 2 series, about the idea of a disease infects people. It unfortunately gets through the world quite quickly and kills a lot of people. And each episode is about the survivors who live in this farming community, but it's an exploration of the ethical consequences. Not simply ethical, like how does the world change and how do laws change, but also the idea of what to do with certain challenges. So, for example, if you have pregnancy in the town, how are you going to deal with that when most of the population is dead and the hospitals in itself were a kind of ground zero for the disease, so you've got challenges getting to the medication. But I digress. That's one of the high points of the series along with Blake Seven. But The Changes was one I've watched more recently. It was part of a collection of TV shows which there were 2. I got them for the idea from Charlie Brooker's Screenwrite. They got the comedian Stuart Lee to explore his own childhood's interpretation of what it's like to be, well, a child and a teenager compared to what it's like as a modern day thing. And at the time, because Screenwrite is a bit old, the other show was Skins. And he made the comparison with Children's Stone and The Changes about how what it got across very naturally was using these fantastical ideas to show that actually being a child sometimes in the world is quite a scary thing. Children of the Stone explores it through the idea of there are these Machiavellian plans going on, and you see it through the perspective of a boy who's trying to maneuver around this new town he's in. And Changes does the same, but from the perspective of a girl. Now, the plot of The Changes, which is actually based on a book series, which I've never read but would like to, by Peter Dickinson, It's a strange one because of the way it's executed. The first episode is a brilliant start on it, but it goes in some very weird directions later. So, one day, out of nowhere, a noise starts being produced. We don't know where it's coming from. It's assumed it's coming from technology, which causes the population of Britain, at least, to destroy technology. Obviously, the parameters of what technology is very specific. This is a 1970s talking about modern technology. They didn't start destroying things like clothing, which obviously is a form of technology when you think about how it's been produced. Or they're not attacking things of wheels for simply having a wheel. They start attacking things like the toaster, the TV, the light bulbs, all the more modern technology. And they go into this rage until the technology is destroyed and they calm down. Now, in the middle of this story is a girl who finds herself basically splitting off from her parents and having to venture around whilst trying to get to her parents, who she knows are trying to get to France. It's an interesting one in comparison to Children's Stone, where Children's Stone was a mini-series. This is a mini-series too, but it's a mini-series where it's 10 parts, and it's actually watching Nikki travel through several places trying to get there, but the challenges she faces as she goes through. What is the consequence of this new world where technology has become so opposed? And in a certain extent, it's really interesting in the sense that even though it hasn't been explained yet, I'm about 8 episodes in, I'm watching the 9th just earlier, they haven't really explored. They've explored it in very interesting ways. For example, it's not simply that technology is being destroyed, but people, even when talking about technology, get disturbed. They talk about a tractor and they find themselves almost mentally terrified and disgusted by it. The word wicked comes up a lot in the show. Wicked things. It's a really interesting show, but it has some flaws. The flaws being some really weird ideas, which, as a mixed-race, half Asian, in particular half Indian, I find a bit cringeworthy, but I respect it's a product of the time. I'm not going to go into spoilers, but a specific religious group, let's call it a specific foreign group, has an immunity to the technology because they live their lives differently, which to me is a bit condescending. And it's not Hinduism, but something which I've come across sometimes when it comes to a Western cinema's view of India is they always have an Indian voice like this, talking about how India is such a spiritual place. And it's this idea that there's something magic and exotic about India. Now, I love India, but when I go to India, I don't see a magical, exotic place. I see, ultimately, different people living through the same things we do, just in different ways. You know, Indian children go to school like British children or American children. You know, people go to jobs. They might have a different way and different approaches to handling things, but they have the same principles as, and in many ways the same lifestyles as. India has technology. Maybe in the 1970s there was this viewpoint of, and in this group, I won't say what religion they are, but it's a more Asian-associated religion, that they live things differently. But the idea that this religious group would not come in contact with technology, and you have to understand what the show says is they're immune to technology, which was really weird, did make me feel a bit uncomfortable. I mean, I wasn't offended per se. It was just a kind of bizarre. I think they tried to use it as an analogy for showing the benefits of immigration, almost, like there is undertones of this part of the story arc with racism, and it's just not handled very well. But when you get past that, it gets into some interesting tropes which you find with this idea of a regressive society and how they act. And overall, I'd recommend it if you're hardcore, really want to explore that time period. I do think there's more interesting things. I think Children of the Stone is definitely a stronger one. There's something about it, along with things like Day of the Triffids, where I like the unsettling creepiness of it all. This one, it's very 70s. Like, look up The Changes opening credits, and you've got like bongo drums and a kind of terrible, almost old Casio which you played in school type soundtrack for the opening credits, and that soundtrack shines for the whole show. I still have a fondness for it and I've enjoyed watching it, but there's definitely something aspects of it where, if you've ever seen Look Around You, this is Look Around You type music and ideas, obviously that was parodying science TV for kids, but this one, you could see it being at times the soundtrack and certain ideas being a parody when actually it's really trying to take itself seriously. But I do enjoy it. I'd recommend it. There's a BFI collection which was bought for me 2 years ago. It's one of the things I recommend. So yeah, the next thing was part of my book club, which I read, was called My Favourite Things is Monsters. It's done by a writer called, I'm just trying, Emil Ferris. It's an interesting one. The story is based in late 1960s. It's about this little girl who, in a sense, draws herself. The story portrays her. It's a graphic novel. Portrays her looking like a little werewolf kid, and this character is a big monster fanatic. But then one day, her upstairs neighbour kills herself, and it's very reminiscent of the dead dog in the night. If anyone's read that, of a limited child's perspective trying to explore what in the world has happened. But unlike I do have issues with the dead dog in the night. I hope I'm saying the name correctly. This one I enjoyed thoroughly. The art style is done with a lot of intricacy. Each page is done like it's done she's drawn this whole story in a notepad, like in a A4 binders with like the holes in them, the A4 lined paper. It is gorgeous. I love the way she uses her skill to make contour lines so that they have a lot of depth to the imagery. The story I do think is very enjoyable, although it's part of what at least seems to be 2 parts. It's definitely an interesting. I did expect certain things, I didn't expect other things, and I think that gives it credit. Whatever I expected, I'm not surprised by, but it's done very well. There's an undertone because it's 1960s, and the upstairs neighbour who was a Holocaust survivor. There's this exploration of that, which I think is very interesting. I have to say, it is gorgeous, and I really enjoyed it, and I'd recommend it to other people. I do, however, appreciate it's a pricey book. I'm going to be honest. I bought it for £23. There are certain people who were saying that it was £34, and I'm cautious of spending my money, obviously at times, but it's definitely an interesting book, and a book that I would share with others, and I'd recommend buying if you're in for a more interesting use of the graphic novel technique. And I do recommend it. It was definitely one of my more favourite books compared to the next graphic novel, which I'll say, which is the Best of Future Shocks. It's not the Best of Future Shocks. It's a Future Shocks archive from the early years. It's about 4 years worth. It's a combination of several artists, obviously. It's called The Complete Future Shocks Volume 1. It's got all the classics, Alan Moore, amongst other things. Stephen Moore, Dave Gibbons is the artist. But it's a collection of basically the archive collection, very similar to the Judge Dredd collections which they've created. This one is a mix. It's a 320-page book. Yeah. It's one which I wouldn't so much recommend unless you're a hardcore 2000 AD. And even then, I think if you're a person who grew up with it and wants a nostalgia kick, you'd enjoy it more than a person who's trying to archive the whole experience 2000 AD. Because to put it bluntly, several of these stories have not aged well. I find it really funny that one of the things that they sell it to people is they've linked it under Alan Moore, because of Alan Moore is the godfather of great story writing. But nonetheless, it's a funny one in the sense that early science fiction, it kind of puts forward the point, frankly, that science fiction works when it's combined with other genres to make it more interesting. Pure science fiction, especially in a thing like 2000 AD, where you had about 6 to 8 pages to deliver, is very hard. It's a skill, but I think it has to have more to it than just simply being a science fiction idea. Now, at this point, 3 things make me think of this book. Firstly, there's an old Robot Chicken sketch called What a Twist. in What a Twist, they basically are taking the make up M. Shyamalan Night, where every 30 seconds a new revelation would happen, and M. Shyamalan Night would go, what a twist! And they're mocking that to a certain extent. The other thing is Twilight Zone, which I do love. I watched the first 2.5 seasons intensely with my cousin, and we do try and get back to it whenever we can. But it's a brilliant example of early perspectives on science fiction, but it's done very well at times. And then there's the parody of it called The Scary Door, which Futurama does. I recommend people watching the Scary Door collection, where basically it was a clip of a TV show they're all watching, and it's a collection of the actual joke sketches which represented what Scary Door is. And that is very much what Future Shocks feels at times. It feels like a weaker Twilight Zone, where everything is a twist, like, oh yes, this is happening, but then at the final big splash page you realise everything is not as it seems, and that is a lot of what this book is about. Now, don't get me wrong, there are some very funny ones, but the ones where it hits well is when it's a 2000 AD story but with an addition. So there are stories in there which is a 2000 AD science fiction story where the actual focus is the comedy. There's a 2000 AD stories which are like a spy thriller. Those are the ones where it's brilliant and it stands up well. The ones where it's pure sci-fi for the sake of sci-fi, where, oh look, we've got this weird idea, but they always resort to what a twist endings to make it more interesting, and that's where it doesn't really work. The next book I want to point out is a Marvel book, which I borrowed from the library, which is called Avengers No Surrender. It's a rather chunky book. It is a story which is roughly 15 issues combined into a graphic novel. Its story basically is around the idea of... It's planned as a kind of consolidation of the Marvel line, the Avengers line. There's been several branchings off of the Avengers. There's been an Avengers which is run around AI in the past. There's the Young Avengers. There's all these different Avengers ideas. There's Occupy Avengers, Uncanny Avengers, which was a combination of certain X-Men and certain Avengers to create a new team. And it was basically a plan to consolidate them in this big storyline. The basic plot is the Earth has been stolen. One day the Earth has been stolen. It's just been taken out of orbit and has been placed somewhere. And I'm not going to give too much away. It's actually 16 issues where there's a competition. It kind of rings a bell with Secret Wars, the first Secret Wars. Not the very good Secret Wars by Jonathan Hickman a few years ago. First Secret Wars, they have a fondness for it, but there's definitely aspects of it which hasn't aged well for all its 80s-ish. But anyway, I enjoyed it. I acknowledge that I got it from the library, so I wonder if somehow my judgment is based on the fact that I got it for free. It's fun. It acknowledges what it is. It has some interesting little threads going through it. So I want to read this issue to issue unless this was portrayed. I hope this was done weekly, because if this was done over 15 months, it would get very, very long-winded. I think it might have been like when the X-Men did a few issues years ago around I think her name was Eve. She was the girl who was supposed to bring back the mutant race. They did several things where they did it week to week. But the story was basically about the Avengers trying to handle this competition which is going on around them. It's very fun. I do like how they use different characters in a very interesting fashion. They brought together a lot of characters which I didn't know about, and I thought, wow, they're done in a very interesting fashion. There's a very cynical story idea behind it, that deep down they're trying to consolidate it to make it more accessible for potential Avengers movie fans. It's possible. I don't want to be too much of a cynic, but people have said this. All I can say is I enjoyed it. It is 15 quid on Amazon, and you don't know how much it's going to cost in the store. For an Avengers story, it's enjoyable. It's a very chunky story. It kind of depends on how hardcore Avengers you are. Like, I've enjoyed Avengers, but I've only ever really enjoyed the new Avengers run, which was done by Bendis. And I read a little bit after that. I read the Hickman run when it was the Times Running Out storyline. But that got a bit confusing because it felt like I had to read 2 series to fully understand it. And then when the New Avengers came back after Secret Wars, I kind of just said, you know what, enough's enough. This is not the Avengers I signed up for. Not that it was bad, I just was not personally a fan. It was fun. It comes down to how much of an Avengers fan you are. You probably will buy it if you want to, or read it in issues, or if you're not that much of a fan, find a more affordable way to get it. Next one I'm going to do is Spider-Man Worldwide, Go Down Swinging. Now, Spider-Man Worldwide was part of an interesting story after Secret Wars, in which Spider-Man, or Peter Parker, is kind of doing a bit of a Batman Incorporated. He's wealthy, he's finally having the confidence to be not simply the photographer, and he is now this worldwide businessman. Now, the Worldwide story is a bit weird in the sense that there were several volumes of Worldwide because of his worldwide business ventures, and then they kind of just brought him back to Earth. His thing fell apart, and I always kind of knew that. They've done it before with Brand New Day, getting rid of MJ. There's a reason they did it. They did it because deep down, Peter Parker works when he's struggling to get by. He's not a guy who deserves financial stability. He's not the guy who has a happy marriage. He's a guy who's trying to balance his life with a superhero. He's trying to look after his Aunt May and do right by her, whilst also trying to stop the Dr. Octopus from making an insane machine. He's trying to have a dating life, but it's kind of hard to commit to someone with intimacy if you have this large secret that you're a not caped crusader, obviously, but you know what I mean. And also you're trying to get by balancing the paycheck when you've also got to pay not only for food and drink and accommodation, but also to get the chemicals to make web fluid. And this is a story which weirdly they created Worldwide, from my understanding. I didn't read all of Worldwide. I did enjoy what I read of Worldwide. Then created the Spectacular Spider-Man, which was the aftermath of Worldwide, the next run. Then finally did this volume of almost like a couple of final volumes of Worldwide. And Go Down Swinging is fun, and it gets the point of Spider-Man. To cut the story short, it's one of those... Oh, sorry, mic went off for just a second muting. It's one of those stories which they've been building up to since a series which I really enjoy called The Superior Spider-Man, involving Norman Osborn. He's been quietly going around, but finally it's the big smackdown of what they're going to do with it. It was a very enjoyable story. What kind of enjoyed about it was a combination of he's got his support team, but even with his support team, he's still getting by by the grit of his teeth. The Green Goblin is now a Red Goblin, and you realise where the Red Goblin, and it's a big problem. There is a big problem right now. And he's trying to get by, and it's affecting every one of his loved ones. It's affecting his best friend and his kids, it's affecting his ex-partners, it's affecting his teammates from other things. And it was a fun story. For the £12.48 I could have got it for, I'm going to be honest, I read it in the library. It is worth it. It's a very enjoyable story. There's a lot of interesting things. And I do recommend it because I enjoy Spider-Man. I think Spider-Man has been written very well. I've not actually bought much Spider-Man, to be honest, but it always feels like there's such a big back catalogue of Spider-Man, especially with the Dan Slott one, because this was, from my understanding, the final Dan Slott story. Dan Slott has been writing at least since Brand New Day, which, if I'm correct, that was just after the Civil War. And that was mid-2000s when you think about it. Brand New Day was originally produced in 2008. That's 10 years of Spider-Man. And a lot of Spider-Man has been produced in there. That's roughly up to potentially 120 issues. And even then, Dan Slott was writing stuff beforehand, And it's a lot of very good Spider-Man, but at times felt like there's so much that it sometimes there's so much to read and so much to find that I read it as much as I could, really. But when I find his books, and I won't deny I use the library more than anything, I do enjoy it. He does do a fun grit of the teeth. He gets Spider-Man. He gets the idea of what Spider-Man's stoic themes are. Dan Slott also is a person who wrote She-Hulk for me, which, especially during the first lawyer run before it kind of lost its way about Volume 5, I thoroughly enjoyed it. It is a very good story. It's a tough story, but it has a good ending, but you don't know what to... the good ending, like with all Spider-Man stories, is very bittersweet with what happens. Me telling you it's a good ending doesn't really tell you that much because there is always consequence. So yeah, I recommend it. It's actually a really good story. Now I'm going to get on to some things that I've watched. So, Netflix, I've been watching iZombie, first 2 seasons. I absolutely love it. I'd previously read the first book, and was not that impressed by it. And actually, I've got to say, the TV series does a better thing with the concept than the comic. Mike Allred is a guy who did Madman, even, not Mad Men, Bliminick. And it's very 1960s. He does his stuff in a kind of zany 1960s style. I was very fond of his art because it reminds me of Silver Age comics, and one of the ways it was used very well was in the X-Force and Ecstatic run, where it was a reality TV show. Now, the comic is kind of like a zany, hey, she's a zombie, and she's trying to find out about things, but it's kind of balanced out with her romance and how there's a lot of fantasy creatures. Like, there's a werewolf who isn't a werewolf, but instead is technically a were-terrier. He turns into a terrier, a Scottish, like a kind of terrier dog boy. There's also vampires. There's hunting agencies which try and track things down. And I wasn't a fan of the comic. I read the first 2 volumes, someone gave them me for free, and then I donated them to the library. The TV series is more a police procedural with a twist. The whole point is the main character was on this brilliant medic, happy relationship, and everything was going fine until she was at a boat party where a zombie attacked. She becomes a zombie. She needs to feed on brains. But in this world, it's not just they're the Walking Dead. They have the capacity to high function, but they become like the zombies we know, when they don't eat anything for a very prolonged period of time. And then they become mindless. But you can, if you eat routinely every few days, you can stay high functioning. Now, the TV series works on the idea that after all the doctor's things, she makes a point of joining in. She goes and joins a morgue where her forensic partner knows she's a zombie and allows her to eat the brains. And the whole point is, week to week, she's able to access the memories and help fight crime with that knowledge. Now, I'm up to the 3rd series, and what I do like about this show is it hasn't stayed the same. Like any good modern TV show, it's explored the idea of what it's like to have a world where zombies exist in the way that they do. What are the consequences? What compromises do you have to make to have this world exist? It is very fun. Obviously, like many of these shows, they follow an archetypal thing of the first half a season, maybe whole season even, they use the police procedural and get you used to that. Then they start fleshing out other ideas, and it's done very well. I recommend it. It's one of the things where it's hard to say, would you spend money on a box set? I'm not against buying on a box set, but if you've got Netflix, it's there, and I'd recommend watching it. I'm up to the 3rd season now, but I've only watched a bit, and I don't want to go into too much into that. It's got 4 seasons so far. It's going to have a 5th and final season. It is very good fun. The next thing I want to talk about is Legion, which is by FX, although in combination with Fox if you watch it in Britain. Now, I've watched this on Sky Go. I'm very lucky that a friend gave me a Sky Go login. I enjoy it. I think a lot of people's interest in the TV show... it is interestingly a comic character who I think I talked about previously in an X-Men Legacy. His name is Legion. they use Legion in a different way here. To put it bluntly, there are only 2 characters so far in the series. It's not like Avengers or the X-Men movies, where it's like, you know that character? Yeah, it's that character, you know, where they're doing a lot of fan service. There are 2 characters in this series. There is Legion, another character, and everyone else in the series is very much, from my understanding, new characters. I've done a bit of research, but it hasn't been thorough. There are certain characters who, to a certain extent, feel like they're like other characters. Like, there's one character who's like Rogue, but not Rogue, and the powers aren't exactly like Rogue. There's similarities, but I will not tell you that's Rogue. There's differences. The storyline focuses around David Haller, who has been in a psychiatric institute. He has lived with schizophrenia. He keeps hearing voices. But what the story starts to portray very early on are the voices basically a psychiatric illness, or are they a telepathic power? Has he had all these years of these powers? And what the series explores is this guy's own understanding of his own mind and his own challenges as he joins this new organization which want to help him develop these powers because they feel he's got a lot of potential. Now, what I give credit about this series is the directions it takes. You see, what it gets very well about David is, to put it bluntly, David Haller, Legion character in the comic books, is a very conflicting character. He's a very interesting character in the sense that what they do in the series, the comic, so they don't do in the series, is he is probably one of the most powerful mutants in the world, but he does actually have mental illness with the powers. See, in the comic, they say that he's got multiple personalities, but each of his mutant powers he accesses is a different personality. And they did a brilliant run of a comic called X-Men Legacy, which in many ways, until they created a new comic series, which I think was a bit pointless and really a bit annoying, was an exploration of him trying to get his powers under control and use his powers for good. Because the problem with the character is he's done a lot of misguided things, and they handle this misguidedness very well in at least the second series. The first series, it's not they're misguided, it's just we're getting used to the character. By the end of the second series, so much has changed that the idea of who is good and who is bad, and is this person technically a villain anymore, is this person technically a hero, and this is not just about Legion, this is about everyone. It's really conflicting. And that's what they get very well about him and the characters around him. Because the point is, in the comic, David Haller is he's a villain in the strangest sense. He's not an outright villain in the sense that he's megalomaniacal. You don't really think that he's full-out sociopathic, but there's definitely a part of him which a lot of the problems he's caused has come from a misguided well-meaningness. It's either been because he wants to right a wrong, or it's that he wants to be the hero. It comes from a kind of source of immaturity almost. And that's what the TV series it sometimes gets. Like, he's a very misguided character, because by the end of the series 2, you're left in this place where I'm not going to tell you what it is. You might assume something from what I say, but it's a very different place from where it was even in the first series. And your views of everyone, there's a lot of potential for conflict and debate. Is he still the hero? Is he the bad guy? And I do recommend it as a series. It's got amazing visuals. Like, if anyone ever watched Hannibal or American Gods, where they had Brian Fuller as the visual producer, you understand the potential for interesting ideas. It's done really well. So I recommend it. Next one, I'm going to be quick. I was at a film night with some friends, and we watched The Meg. It is fun. It is very reminiscent of Deep Blue Sea, not in a bad way. It's got a fun cast. There are little, most of the cast you won't know, but there is, of course, the main man himself, action movie extraordinaire, Jason Statham. And for that reason, it's just fun. I'm not going to say much about it. I I just can't emphasize enough that it's one of those films, though, which I will say, in my honest opinion, there's this part of me which wonders, like, I wish cinemas had varying ticket prices. Like, there are certain films which are art house, which I feel like I would pay the extra money for, based on the justification that it's going to have a smaller audience and it should have the tickets cost a little bit more. And then there's the Hollywood blockbuster, where sometimes I wish cinemas would make us pay less for them. Because the problem is with certain things, is like, if you were going to buy a game which was full of fun explosions, but was a bit shorter, and you didn't have much expectations except for the explosions, would you pay the same £40 that you would pay the £60? I apologise, games haven't been £40 for a long time. Would you pay the £60? That would be the same cost as a sprawling RPG, where for £60 you get a whole universe. Probably not. In the same way with this type of film, I love it, and I thought it was so much fun watching it with my friends. But would I pay a full price ticket for it? Now, I don't think anyone really cares. It had a big blockbuster and it's done well. But it's a film which is so much fun. But would I pay a full price ticket for it? Probably not. If you can find a cheap DVD, yes. If you're willing to pay a tenner for it, it's one of those films where, like, you want to watch it with your mates and have a bit of a laugh. And that's the main thing. Jason Statham and everyone in it is having a laugh, and that's what makes it so much fun. It is fun. I think people probably... I'm not going to say people should watch it, but if you're looking for a bit of a laugh, it's extremely enjoyable. Tokyo Godfather, I've had it on for years on DVD, until someone bought it me on Blu-ray for Christmas. Yeah, last Christmas. This one is a funny story about these three homeless people who find themselves with a baby. They don't know where the baby's from, but they feel it is their mission. It's a calling. They are basically been sent almost as the three wise men to find get the baby to safety and find out what the heck is going on with this baby. It's a funny story of happenstance and coincidence, where aspects of their lives as individuals, which may have led to them being homeless or the life before homeless, are brought together by trying to protect this baby. There's a lot of imagery, but it's a very fun movie. It acknowledges that it's sad at times. It's really quite beautiful. The art isn't a mind-blowing one. It's a very dark tone, but for a story of a dark night looking after a baby by three homeless people, it's well suited. And I think that does it really well. I would recommend it. You can probably find a cheap DVD of it anywhere. You could get the Blu-ray. Whether the Blu-ray really adds extra impact, I'm not sure. I'm one of those people who still feels Blu-ray, after all these years, when now Blu-ray is everything. The transition from VHS to DVD was a big difference, and there was a justification for justifying buying things on DVD compared to VHS. The Blu-ray change was, in my opinion, for the most part, a graphical increase, which works if you've got the best TV for it. If you don't have the biggest TV, it doesn't really have an impact. But it also works for very specific things. Like, yes, I've been told Avatar is amazing on Blu-ray. But also things like Blue Planet and Planet Earth, it works well. There are things like this where it's okay. It may not require a Blu-ray. But if you're a big fan of Blu-ray collections, I'd recommend this. The next thing is... It was a myth thing. It was called Batman Legacy. Batman Legacy was a comic series in 2 volumes I borrowed from the library. I would not buy this under normal circumstances. I enjoy Batman, and I remember when I first got into Batman, I chain purchased lots of Batman. The funny thing is, I still enjoy Batman, but I usually buy it in cheap eBay collections. Like, I always write in graphic novels on eBay and look for really, really cheap graphic novels. And so I find myself with a bizarre collection, although I've been really good at spending stuff, buying £5 volumes of this and that. Legacy is a thing which it's one of those things where it's very much a product of its time. It's the 90s. I don't know if it was part of the speculator bubble. It doesn't really feel like it's trying to introduce me new characters. It's basically a globe-trotting terrorism attack by Ra's al Ghul, who's teamed up with Bane, and Batman's trying to stop them. It's also a collection of comics based on Robin, my personal favourite Robin. I know people aren't always a fan of him. The third Robin, Catwoman comics, which the Catwoman comics are okay, but in my opinion, the art's a bit blah and the storyline's a bit blah. And the Detective comic and Batman. I don't really have much to say for it. I read it, the first volume, thought it was okay. Found the second volume and thought I might as well finish the story. It didn't really leave much of an impact on me. You can read it if you're fond of these characters, and there is odd issues in there, like because it's Blaine and Ra's al Ghul teaming up together, there's an interesting, fun little issue, in my opinion, which involves a kind of flashback to how did Bane get with Ra's al Ghul's organisation. And I think it's a fun one issue, but totally not, in my opinion, justifying the rest of the comic. The next thing I want to do is a novel, because yes, I read very few novels. I just never feel like I've got the time for it. But the thing I finally finished was the final Dark Tower book. Now, this will be a review of the whole Dark Tower series, and if I've read the whole Dark Tower series, you know I'm going to enjoy it. I do think the ending was brilliant. And I think it's one of those book series where the ending is very bittersweet. I'm not going to tell you much about the ending, except that there's the ending, and then there's the additional subject matter at the end, which is the true ending. The true ending will leave you in an interesting place. I remember someone telling me before it that, to a certain extent, there's a little thing Stephen King says about continue to read and be damned. Now, I didn't look at the ending in such a negative way as other people did, but I thoroughly enjoyed it. I've enjoyed the series as a whole. It's a very interesting one in the sense that a lot of people use the word epic to tell things. I would definitely say it's grand, and in a certain weird sense it's epic, but when people think epic, they think star systems and space. They don't think epic in this context, but the range of places they travel to and how they get to those places, in my sense, how to say it? If you think of space as a vertical thing going from the Earth upwards, that's a form of vertical epicness. This is more of a horizontal epicness, which sounds really strange, but it does make sense if you read the book series. You'll like it or you won't. I don't want to pass judgment on what other people think. You'll either like it or you won't. Now, the final thing is, but I do recommend it, but like I said, I've read everything. If I didn't like it, I wouldn't have got this far. Is The Machinist, the Christian Bale psychological thriller, which got him a lot of attention because he was so skinny. This was an example of his method acting where he was so skinny, and then he bulked up extremely quickly to become Batman for Batman Begins. But this was the other film. It's a psychological thriller about a man who hasn't slept in his mind for a year. We don't know why, but he's going through the worst case of insomnia ever. Until things start happening with a newer person joins his workplace at a steel mill. Now, if you've watched enough psychological thrillers, and I'm talking about things like on Sony levels, I don't want to give it away, because even giving the examples, which I might give away in a second, we know, if you've watched enough of them, you know what's coming. But in its defense, it also has some really good surprises along the way. Now, I thought it was enjoyable. I kind of thought of myself on this type of psychological thriller. I always think of it as there is a range. So, on one side of it, you've got the best ones of this style. So, let's say 10 out of 10 is, in my opinion, Fight Club and Memento. And if you think about 0 out of 10, this is Revolver by Guy Ritchie, type of psychological thriller. This is definitely an 8. It's definitely got some interesting ideas. On some level, the problem is it's part of a kind of early 2000s to mid-2000s psychological thriller, which we saw from things like Fight Club. We saw from Insomnia, the thriller with Robin Williams in it, where it's about the mind failing the main character and you don't fully understand what's going on, but he doesn't. And the problem is, if you see enough of these, certain things become unsurprising. But in its defense, the direction it goes in, and when you reveal and you learn more about the characters surrounding this main character, and you reveal the challenges he's facing, and you reveal that why each of the characters is facing those challenges, you definitely find yourself in an enjoyable story. I'm glad I've watched it. If it's on Netflix, definitely go watch it at some point. A lot of these films, like psychological thrillers, except for potentially Fight Club, you kind of watch them, and if they're not the greatest thing you ever watched, you're not going to rewatch again potentially, or you won't rewatch often unless you've forgotten. It's one of those things I'd recommend buying a cheap DVD or watching on a streaming site if it's available. That's my 10 cents, and that is actually all I want to talk about. Now, obviously, like per usual, I am not going to listen to this, so it has probably got some errors early on, but I'd like to hope it's come across a bit smoother. I was really glad that someone left a comment on one of my videos. I'm one of these people who's very bad at sharing. I'll share it on my Twitter. I don't want any of my Facebook friends to know. It sounds really depressing, but I don't. If you like it, please comment. I don't want to be one of those people who says like, share, and subscribe. That's down to you. I'm not sure how often I'll do this, but maybe I just felt a bit of energy and I thought I'd have a go at sharing it. So, hopefully I'll speak to you later when I've got more things I've watched and reviewed. And there's not many games I've played recently. I'm slowly making my way through Hyper Light Drifter and why is my mind gone that? It's the Sega game, Evil Within. I'm slowly making my way through them. They're quite chunky games and I thoroughly enjoyed them, but when I finish those I'll let you know. Speak to you later. Bye.